dear listeners. In today's episode, we return to the Bolaño-verse with Roberto Bolaño's novel Distant Star, a, might we say, study of evil, in which the narrator, Arturo Bolaño, recounts the history that he has with a mysterious figure, one Carlos Weider or Alberto Ruiz Tagle, who may be a intelligence agent for the Chilean authoritarian regime, who definitely is a serial killer, and who is, importantly, a failed poet. And so today's episode, we sort of recorded after the election, so there's some rambling digressions into politics, poetry, how to live within history, and what lessons can we learn from Roberto Bolaño's sort of conception of this novel and even his composing process. Brief content warning, we do talk about the politically motivated killings which took place during the Pinochet regime in Chile, which is sort of a dark subject matter, but Bolaño kind of arrives at it via this sort of fictional creation of this serial killer. So I just wanted to put in a brief content warning up top if anyone is thinking about that. But I think overall, it's a pretty good episode. We talk about politics, history, the role of literature in reading and all this. And so brief content warning on that, but I think it's a great episode. We talk about a lot of interesting stuff. And we get into what makes Bolaño so good. And as always, we hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Fucking all over the place tonight.
Again, these are sort of unorganized. They're sort of basically I have topics. I have quick chapter summaries. I have a couple of Weider's poems. I have a random question that I want to ask you. Then I have some names that I think are important, and then I just ran a bunch of quotes. So well, I also have a planned digression about a reference to a book in his psychopathic murder exhibition that I really, really want to talk about because I find this particular detail to be sort of horrifying in a way that I feel like only Bolaño can do, where he kind of like suggests something without like spelling it out. So, but yeah.
Yeah, I definitely got that vibe, like when they find like the pornography in this book, and I was like, I bet that's really bad pornography.
Yeah, and they also, that actually is mentioned again in 2666, where they talk about a pornographic film set in which is concealed a snuff film set, like it like backdoors into a snuff film, and I think that was like a sort of echo of that. So
the Roberto Bolaño extended universe, which is just the reality we live in. It's just real life.
Yeah, which is just real life. Yeah.
You better enjoy the extended universes.
You're living in one. Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of the Infinite Library podcast, a podcast that talks about Roberto Bolaño. I'm your host, Ben.
And I'm your co-host, John. I was going to try to do a funny joke and say that I was someone else, but Ben, I have some bad news for you.
Oh, what?
This episode is unfortunately relevant because there's a dang Cheeto in the White House.
Yeah, the Cheeto's back. Well, you could have said it's me, Han Jagley. This is a podcast about the dang Cheeto being back at the White House.
Hans Jagley would be like a great name if I decided to become a German guy.
Yeah, you could rebrand as a German poet, Hans Jagley. Yeah, you could join the barbaric writers. Yeah, so
You know, I'll say this: being in the barbaric writers sounds somewhat easier than doing actual writing.
Yeah, you just have to. Well, this is a reference to the book we're covering, Distant Star, in which to join the barbaric writers, all you have to do is shit on the classics, literally. So.
Hey, not just shit on them, piss on them, eat them, come on them.
Yeah, and then I like how that it's just like then the writer is ready to write. It's like
a glimpse inside the master studio.
So yeah, this is a podcast about the dang Cheeto being back in the White House. Also about how there might be a Nazi psychopath who is making his way across the world in an effort to write the purest poetry known to man. Well, yeah, we're as I mentioned, we're covering Distant Star, folks. John, what did you think of Distant Star? I've read this before, and I wanted us to read it for a number of reasons, but I wanted your just initial impression. What did you think of this story that is possibly one of the more evil books Bolaño's written about, and evil in like a direct way as well, because he's indirect in other senses, but this is just like, I would say this is like almost pure evil at times. So.
Yeah, so I'd still call myself like a bit of a Bolaño neophyte. This is my fourth Bolaño. I started with Nazi Literature in the Americas, which is still one of my favorite books by him, but not necessarily where a lot of people start with his work. Then obviously last year we did, or I guess it was the beginning of this year, we did By Night in Chile. And then over the course of this year, I read one of his short story collections, The Insufferable Gaucho. And then now I'm reading this. So Bolaño is, I mean, what can you say? He's one of the most interesting writers of the last, at least half century, if not more than that. And yeah, this book is evil in a way that not a lot of books are. It's really interesting. I have not read kind of the two big ones. I haven't read Savage Detectives and I haven't read 2666 yet. They're on the list, but hard to find the time sometimes. But it's really kind of impressive to me what he is able to do with like a scant 150 pages.
Yeah.
In a way that, I mean, I'm sure again, like those two huge books, like maybe don't improve, but I'm sure they manage to do just as much or more with just the more space. But the fact that he's able to do both that kind of sprawling, epic scope stuff like that people think so highly of, but then he's also able to do these just like real, like literary gut punches.
Yeah.
With books like this and By Night in Chile and some of his short fiction work, it just is. I mean, it's you don't get a lot of writers like that, like in a generation, and the fact that he, despite kind of writing books that feel deeply evil and like. Particularly if you live in America, like deeply implicate like the just evil nature of like your existence in the world, and yet he still like is so popular and well regarded even by kind of institutional literary circles. I think is really interesting and speaks to just the talent he had and to not to chive out, but fuck cancer. I'd love to hear what Bolaño thought about a dang Cheeto being in the White House. Again.
Yeah, I'm sure he would manage to say something about it that's both apt and like a little confusing at times, not in like a bad way, but in a way that like sort of like really to me gets my juices flowing. And I feel like that's also why I like Bolaño. And like we talked about it By Night in Chile, that has like a really cutting denunciation for like what it even means to read, given that like political horrors are perpetrated almost every day. Like, and in a way, like Distant Star kind of looks at this in a similar angle. What if a guy who was ostensibly a poet was a psychopathic murderer. and I think I want to make a distinction here. I said this book was deeply evil, but I think it's more like, there are some like works, movies, literature that like release evil into the world. And I think this is just like a very, very close look at like what an evil person who writes poetry looks like and why that happens and how that affects people. And I think there's a lot about like the shadow of World War II in the Americas and how that sort of infiltrates to this day. I think it's also part of this book. And I don't know, the fact that, as you said, John, that he can do it in 150 pages and also just like give you things that are sort of confused and unresolved, but also like hinting and implicating. He's managed to do a lot. And I think that speaks to his training as a poet, is that he can condense in a way that's like just really readable. And to me, being somebody who was like, because I remember getting most into Bolaño when I was like taking a couple of fiction writing courses. It seems like he was doing stuff that like you weren't allowed to do. So that's like one of the reasons that I like talking about him and reading him as well. So
yeah, no, I definitely agree. In terms of what you're saying about evil, I think that with Bolaño, the thing that I'm always struck by is, at least again in the works I've read of his, I think it's fair to call him a horror writer. But he is able to do so much by, if anything, understating the things he's talking about. The fact that he's always hinting at like the greater horror, which is not, Cthulhu or something. In this case, it's literally just like the blood-soaked machinery that like makes modern society like function.
Yeah.
The fact that he's able to like understate that, but it still is this thing where you read these books and it's hard, especially again, like as an American, not to come away like feeling somewhat implicated. I think so much about that scene in By Night in Chile with the party and, all these artists on upstairs, and then the guy gets lost because he's drunk in this huge house and he stumbles downstairs and finds a guy being tortured to death, like in the basement, and just like the way that divide functions.
Yeah. And as we talked about in the beginning, somebody goes like, oh, wasn't there like a curfew? Why were we allowed to do this? Like, and suddenly you're like, oh, something bad's about to happen. Like, yeah. And then just like walking downstairs from the high culture into like what is ostensibly like driving all of this. Yeah. Torture, extortion, murder. So,
yeah. I'm not like a big like, art can change the world. Like art, if we could just get, Joe Biden to read Roberto Bolaño, he'd see the light, and we'd stop doing global genocides. I don't think that, obviously, but I do think that there is something very powerful in just the ability to look at evil and like show evil, but not to do it in like a way that makes the evil like some kind of joke or exaggerates it like into a like rubber mask monster that you can put the book down and like stop thinking about.
Right.
And
yeah.
I think that is something that even like kind of quote unquote politically conscious horror can do a lot, where you make it so cartoonish, so over the top, even when you're dealing with things that are ostensibly like relating to real life things, that as a reader, it's very easy to just create that divide in your head, to create that upper floor, lower floor dichotomy, and to put the book down at the end and be like, well, luckily that was all fake. Bolaño makes it a lot harder to do that.
Yeah, they're like disquieting, but in a way that I feel like makes me think more, which is partly why I like them. They're like, it's like they're generative, a lot of his stuff.
Yeah.
And I think I just wanted to add, I think this serves as a nice like preamble to 2666, because like in a way, like when I said this was direct, I feel like Bolaño works best, as you were saying, in like suggestion and sort of like tracing an outline. And a lot of 2666 is like tracing a huge outline of evil, where it's like just like walking around like a precipice or like a crater. And in some ways, like we could say that the protagonist
the murderer I've been referring to, the murderer, is like the crater, but this gets like right up to the edge. Like it's like it's right up to the edge, and it's in like you see the effects of everything, and you see like the way he like dissipates into history, and it's like, yeah, and then thankfully it gets wrapped up at the end in a way that's like sort of good, but at the same time like leaves a lot open.
Yeah, we'll get more into this as we go, but something I was very struck by reading this book is the way that it kind of made me think about sort of how individuals experience history. I know that's something we've talked about before on the show, reading stuff like The Fraud or like Tun Huang. Just kind of the multiple layers at which history is experienced by people, and the fact that historical forces are like manifested by individual people, but are also larger than them.
Yeah.
There's always, in every uprising of fascist violence, it is always individual people holding the guns, but they're also, emissaries of something larger than just their own individual selves. And, that goes in reverse too, in terms of, resistance to fascism or cowardice in the face of fascism in some cases. And I think Bolaño is very adept at, again, kind of picking out how that works and how that affects people's lives and people's kind of individual consciences in a way that, I just think is really masterful. Something I found interesting, Ben, because I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the genesis of this book.
Yeah.
Something I didn't realize when you first suggested it, in fact, didn't realize until literally today as I was kind of prepping for today's episode. This is one of his like really early works too.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm looking at his I have like his Wikipedia page pulled up, and I'm looking at his bibliography, and it's kind of he has like a very interesting kind of publishing history, because his works were not like translated what's the word I'm looking for? Oh my gosh. Contemporaneously, yeah. So like this book was put out in 1996, but did not come out in English until 2004. Whereas By Night in Chile was put out in 2000, but came out in 2003. So that I think is a little interesting. At least this is like an early work, and the fact that this book comes like before Savage Detectives, and then By Night in Chile comes after Savage Detectives, I think is also really cool, because again, I think that just shows again the ways he's able to move in and out of these different registers so confidently. I think that a lot of writers, you would expect them to do all the short form work and then all the long form work, or vice versa. It'd be something that they, really divided up their career by kind of the type of work they were doing. Whereas Bolaño, he's constantly working in like all these different types of prose. He's still doing poetry. He's still writing essays and short stories. Like, it's just a really amazing career.
And John, it should be added that like, so after this came out, he basically wrote his ass off until he died, because he realized that like there was this sort of need for his fiction, especially in translation. And if you could produce more of it, then his family, because he had a kid and he was married, would be able to survive when he died. And I don't remember when he got his cancer diagnosis, but like it wasn't soon, I think, after Distant Star, where he sort of ramped up his like literary production. And he basically would joke that he considers himself a poet, but he is making money and providing for his family by writing fiction. So it's sort of like in my heart I'm a poet, but I'm doing this for my family. And one of the techniques that he does, which I think is so fascinating, is like he will expand or like break off stuff for like smaller or bigger stories as like the occasion provides. So for instance, like Amulet is a short novella version of just one monologue in The Savage Detectives. And this book, Distant Star, was written almost at the same time as Nazi literature in the Americas, and in fact is a sort of expansion of one of the sort of segments in Nazi literature in the Americas. And I have a very funny quote about this that I wanted to just read by a friend of Bolaño's, who's also a very good author in his own right, Enrique Villamatas, who wrote a very good anthology book called Bartleby and Co., which is about writers who don't write, which I definitely recommend. But the quote goes, it's worth reading. And so it was always with Bolaño, one book springing from another, everything connected in some way. In fact, Distant Star emerged at the precise instant in which Heralde, who's Bolaño's agent, in his office at Anagramma, asked Bolaño if he had some unpublished novel, something recently written that he could publish. Such a novel didn't exist, but Bolaño claimed otherwise and wrote it in 3 weeks. Record time. He took time off to do it. And because his work always advanced by means of these unfurlings of one novel into another, a considerable number of words of Nazi literature in the Americas, too. Between the end of the latter, look after yourself, Bolaño, he said, and off he went, and Distant Star, look after yourself, my friend, he said, and off he went. I think I always preferred that, look after yourself, Bolaño. But of course, this is anecdotal. Much less so is that in the days following his delivery of the manuscript to Anagramma, Bolaño went through some difficult times and also fortunate ones. He was pleased about this apparent stroke of luck, in which a certain fear and smile was weak with nervousness, as if the possibility the publishing house might discover that part of the text was lifted from his own prior work both scared and amused him. So again, it's like, oh, I hope they don't find out that I was kind of doing two things at the same time, so to speak. But I think that's like a cool technique. And as you said, John, I think that like helps him to sort of ratchet from levels of like, yeah, what he's trying to do with each story.
Well, that's actually really interesting. I didn't put this together exactly until, we've just been talking about this, but it almost kind of puts Bolaño like in the tradition of like great pulp writers.
Yeah.
Like this guy who wasn't like in love with writing prose, but was making good, like a reasonable amount of money doing it. And it just motivates this enormous, like somewhat self-referential, but incredibly fascinating, like body of work.
Yeah. Well, I would even say, like, speaking of self-referential, like, did you catch the Father LaCroix appearance in Distant Star?
Yes.
Well, okay, we can get into it, but I even love that in that, like, basically the Distant Star character that we talked about appears in By Night in Chile appears in Distant Star, and I also like that Bolaño includes his morbid fascination with the Greeks, where, like, he's talking about the psychopathic poet character, and he's like, and he was saying that he sounded like these people, but as always, this list revealed more about the author of the list than the person he was describing. And then it's just a list of Greek authors, like, which is like a total reference to when in By Night in Chile, he just sort of hides out from the Allende administration, just reading the Greeks all day in like a complete like moment of just like, yeah, I don't support this democratic revolution, basically.
Mania.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so should we jump in, John, or is there anything else you want to talk about up front?
Nothing else. Well, I guess my question, Ben, is so when we were kind of planning this season, we did not choose to do this book based on the political situation we find ourselves in. But I'm curious, like, out of all the Bolaños we could have done, because we did, think we wanted to do another Bolaño just because we wanted to. But you suggested this one in particular, and I'm just curious, like, what was your like? Why? If someone like wanted to read Bolaño, wanted to read more Bolaño, why would you recommend like this one as like a cool book to read versus maybe one of the better known ones?
Well, I'd say probably for two reasons. One, it's almost sort of like a detective story in a way that sort of unfurls confusingly. And I think that is just sort of like a baseline interesting plot. Like you'd mentioned pulp earlier. I think Bolaño has a lot of affections for plot, or pulp rather. And two, I don't know, there's just something about like some of the dropped references in this book that really to me speak to like, the return of World War II, the past inflecting into the present, the way like one's country affects one's like way of life and future. Like there's just a lot of like really charged stuff in here, and it passes to me very effortlessly and quickly through like 150 pages. And I think given the light of the dang Cheeto being back at the White House, I think it's interesting to sort of think about how the next, say, 4 years are going to play out and how they might affect us personally. And I not mean just us personally, Ben and John, but just like people living in America. And I think one of the things that I found to be most poignant in Distant Star, which we could talk about, is when the narrator has one of the best nights of his life immediately after the military coup in Chile. And we'll talk about that later, but that's the kind of like friction that I think is like useful to keep in mind, and I think could also inform the ways that we move into the future as well.
Very cool. All right. Well, yeah, let's actually talk about the book proper instead of just talking around it. So compared to, By Night in Chile, this definitely has like a little bit more of a plot, but not exactly.
Yeah.
More or less, we kind of spend the book in the shoes of a poet,
Arturo Bellano, otherwise introduced as Arturo B in the introduction. Also, John, did you catch the Pierre Menard reference in the introduction?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. So in the introduction, we're told that the narrator, who supposedly I guess is Bolaño, learned about this story from Arturo Bolaño, and Arturo tells him, I don't think that this story, we didn't do a good job with this story. Basically, like it could have been better. As he says at one point, rather than being, what is it? Hold on.
My role was limited to preparing refreshments, consulting a few books, and discussing the reuse of numerous paragraphs with Arturo and the increasingly animated ghost of Pierre Menard.
Which I think is also the reuse of paragraphs. That's basically what we just talked about. So yeah, the Pierre Menard reference is like, let's rewrite the story from a different angle, and that's going to change it. It's also a nice reference to Borges. There's just like a whole lot just in the intro as to like what kind of story you're about to expect. And it's like, yeah, a retelling of a story that Bolaño has already told, but from a different angle and in a way that is both a mirror and an explosion, which is a great turn of phrase.
Yes. So we follow this Arturo Bellano kind of over the course of his life from the time. Yes, we're following kind of the general like kind of arc of his life and particularly his contact with another writer named Carlos Vider. At least that's what he's known as when they. Oh wait. Yes. Okay,
well, Carlos Vider is his true name, but he's known as. It's
Alberto Ruiz Tagle.
Yeah, or Tagle. Yeah, one of the two.
But we kind of follow him, and particularly his kind of relationship is a strong way to put it, but kind of the ways that this other person kind of weaves through his life from the time where he is they're classmates together in what seems to be basically like an MFA program at Universidad de Concepción in Chile, starting in the Allende government, and then kind of going on from there. And more or less, we find out relatively quickly that Mr. Ruiz Tagle is a fascist, a murderer, psychopath, has been said, and I assumed some kind of like intelligence asset, like working with the Pinochet regime, but kind of like working as or like kind of being a grad student, like as a cover or something.
Yeah, and I like how that opening kind of starts as like, oh, he was that one guy at the grad school seminar or at the workshop. Something was off about him. Like, is how it starts. It's like he's always like very, he's like listening. He gives feedback. He's fair. But when you read the poems, they like don't seem to be him. Like, it's like, oh, he hasn't found his voice yet. But like the poems are like very bland, Arturo Bolaño describes like one of the poems sounding like another Chilean poet has like a head injury or something, which is like, like such a hilarious description.
Yeah, they're all like boring, like kind of meditations on like nature scenes.
Yeah. Which like one could wonder if that's like a reference to like Hitler poet like painting, where it's just like oh, here's like a landscape or something. But yeah, it's like, oh, his true poetry, you know, he hasn't found his voice yet. And then later it's sort of revealed that one of the beautiful Garmendia sisters, two twin poets in the workshops that Arturo Bolaño and his friend Bibiano Orion are both obsessed with. One of them, maybe both, are in love with Alberto Ruiz Tagle, which causes much jealousy for, you know, Arturo. But then, as it's revealed, he's probably murdering these women. He's murdering only women, female poets, for reasons that are hinted at.
So one thing I like about this first like kind of section of the book is I like the character dynamics a lot. I think that, again, given the very sparse page count here, I think Bolaño does like a really good job kind of fleshing out these like 5 or 6 characters in this like writing program. You know, they're all kind of a type, but in a way that like feels real. Like they don't feel like stereotypes. They feel like the type of people that you would be in like a writing class with, you know, observed by Bolaño, who I'm sure was in a ton of writing workshops over the course of his life. The other thing I really like is the ways that he chooses to show that there's something wrong with this guy.
Yeah.
Like from the jump. Like my favorite detail in this section of Alberto's kind of, yeah, the things that like are off about him is that whereas all his classmates are living in like shitty like corner rooms that they're renting from, you know, in like boarding houses, he lives in like a nice apartment that is like too clean.
Yeah, too clean. It's emphasized how clean it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, it was just like, oh, so he doesn't live here. Like this is just like where he kicks his feet up in between like his real work, which is presumably like right-wing agitation and shit like that.
Yeah, and like yeah, we haven't even got to eventually he starts writing poems in the sky with his, you know, World War II airplane, and like that's like also big propaganda shit, I would say. So
yeah, he's clearly, again, like Bolaño never spells out like exactly what he's doing here. Like it does not come across that he's like really here to like learn how to write poetry. Like it seems like if anything, he's keeping tabs on, you know, again, it's never stated outright, but like I get the impression like he's basically there to keep tabs on like left-wing like student activists, basically, because it's made very clear that one of the other things that's off about him compared to everyone else is like everyone else in this program is like some variety of like left-winger. You know, they mostly seem like they're dilettantes, like, you know, most political people in like writer spaces kind of tend to be, but you know, they're all some stripe of Marxist or anarchist, whereas he is like kind of studiously apolitical.
Yeah, and speaking of that, the quote, the differences between Ruiz Tagle and the rest of us were obvious. We spoke a sort of slang or jargon derived in equal parts from Marx and Mandrake the magician. And then in parentheses, we were mostly members or sympathizers of the MIR or Trotskyite parties, although a few of us belonged to the Young Socialist or the Communist Party or one of the leftist Catholic parties. While Ruiz Tagle spoke Spanish, the Spanish of certain parts of Chile, mental rather than physical regions, where time seems to have come from a standstill. So it's like there's something off about him compared to everyone else.
Yeah, like he feels like I kept imagining him as like looking like a mannequin who'd come to life.
yeah.
Like that's very much like the vibe he gives off. Like there's something just kind of inhuman about him in this way that, yeah, Bolaño does a really good job like getting across in this very eerie way without, kind of dipping into some more histrionic registers about like, oh, he was such a freak. He was such a weirdo. Oh, he creeped me out so much. It's never that. It's always drawn like a lot more subtly, and I like that.
And like one of the nature poems, like Arturo Bolaño says, like a knife appears for reasons which escaped me, which is like a lovely just like image of violence early before it's really revealed what he's doing, and even the narrator doesn't know why it's in that poem, but it's there for some reason. So.
So, as with many Bolaño works, this all comes to something of a head when oh boy, the Pinochet coup happens.
And also it happens in like a line break, which is also how the way sort of history just intrudes upon people in the present. Is like Bibliorano's like, this guy's really freaky. I went to his house. Fat Marta, which we haven't touched on, their friend Fat Marta is like, oh, like, yeah, I hung out with him, but he hasn't found his poetic voice yet. And then they go home and then the coup happens, basically, is what it says.
Again, I find the way Bolaño writes about these really horrifying events like to be very powerful. I mean, he lived through these events. And in fact, much like his avatar within the story, he ended up having to leave the country and be an expat in Spain. And just I think a lot, again, and maybe I'm bringing too much of like contemporary politics into it, but I think about like how much more different stuff like this must have felt like in like a world without cell phones and kind of like the constant like information deluge that we live in now, where things would just happen like far away from you and you couldn't like be trying to follow them obsessively like all hours of the day.
Well, and the way that people are getting like thrown in jail, like that sort of like is happening, and like we're like, oh, it's not going to happen to me. Like, but then it does, which it happens to Arturo Bolaño. But like there's this sort of like cloud of anxiety that disperses over like everyone in terms of who's getting arrested by Pinochet. And, the Garmendia sisters he goes over to the house. They're like, we're leaving. He's worried that they're leaving the country. And they're like, oh, no, we're just going to our parents' house, which is further away from the city. Like, it'll be fine there. And then Bolaño gets to hang out with them. He says it's like, I had one of the happiest times of my life hanging out with these two wonderful sisters in the midst of all this like sort of potential terror and anxiety. But it's like nobody's glued to their phone, doom scrolling, getting updates about it. It just sort of like settles over everything that happens.
Yeah. And like, I'm not trying to say one thing is better than the other by any means, but just kind of the way that that anxiety like manifests just felt very like different to me in this way that felt interesting. Again, I don't know that there's necessarily anything like to take away from it as like a lesson, just again, like the fact that like he goes over and talks to the sisters and they're like, oh yeah, we're just, you get the impression they're kind of trying to skip town to like avoid notice, and maybe like you get the impression their family's kind of wealthy, and you kind of maybe think like, oh, like they're kind of thinking like, oh, if we get out of the city and we like go home, like our parents will maybe be able to protect us, or just like they will see we're not here and they'll go look for someone else. But, you kind of get the impression that it's just this thing where, oh, this is going to blow over eventually. Like, we're going to be fine. Whereas, again, I feel like the mode today is just kind of much more hysterical because you kind of can't ignore everything that's happened. Like, there's no kind of the information deluge once more is this thing that just kind of like lets you just constantly live in anxiety. I don't know. I don't know if I have a point to make here.
Well, and like eventually Arturo gets arrested. We'll circle back, but like Bibiano Orion like thinks he'd been killed, and so when he goes over to his house and he's back from being in prison, like they have like Bibiano Orion like tackles him. His friend like tackles him because he thought he was dead. Like so like there's a lot more like it's like deep-seated uncertainty where it's like everyone would be following it on their phones ahead of time. But the Garmendia sisters go to their parents' house, and then it's a really what's incredible to me is the end of this first chapter. It shifts into Arturo basically goes, I wasn't there, but here's probably what happened. And so Alberto Rios Tagle visits the house of the Garmendia sisters. They read some poetry. They talk about various poets. One of the parents, the aunts, probably doesn't understand it, so they explain it to her. Then they go to sleep, at which point Alberto Rios wakes up in the middle of the night and stabs to death the sisters and the aunts, at which point other people just show up. And as Bolaño says at the end of this chapter, in a way that's worth reading, because he also does it, the men, they greet him with a discreet but respectful nod and peer obscenely at the dark interior, the carpets, the curtains, as if from the very start they were searching out and weighing up places to hide, but they are not the ones who will be hiding. With these men, the night comes into the Garmendia's house. 15 minutes later, or 10 perhaps, when they leave, the night leaves with them. The night comes in, and out it goes again, swift and efficient. And the bodies will never be found. But no, one body, just one, will appear years later in a mass grave, the body of Angelica Garmendia, my adorable, my incomparable Angelica, but only hers, as if to prove that Carlos Vider is a man and not a god. Ooh, yeah, so just stab of darkness at the end. The true, if it's been hinting at before, he's working with the paramilitary government. They're just letting him kill random female poets as a way, like a terror and control mechanism in Chile for Pinochet.
Yes, and you get the impression that this act, like it's presumably like an act of serial killing, and you get the impression that it's also like for Arturo or / Carlos, like it's an artistic act in and of itself. That
yes,
committing these murders and kind of this attempt at this magic trick of just making these people completely disappear, like is a performance for him. This is some kind of expression of his literary, or like this is his poetic voice.
Right, which is like, it's such a like, one, it's like, okay, yeah, the frustrated artist has become killer is like definitely like some sort of, we could get Freudian with it and talk about like sublimation of drives, but also like, I like, again, we talked about Night in Chile, like how Bolaño is all about like literature is super important, but it's also meaningless. And in this one, it's like literature is super important, but also like the creative act has a great capacity for darkness. And he sort of like puts it in this like failed Nazi poet, megalomaniac guy who, his true voice is to kill. So
creation is not like an inherently positive act as much as we like to think that it is.
And I think that's sort of the fun part with Bolaño, because I think if he was all like, oh, these poets, these wonderful poets, like he would be a little more sentimental, and I think he couches it in this kind of like understanding about how small it could be and how dark it could possibly be. So
well, I mean, kind of one of the big stereotypes of the fascist is that they're all failed artists, and there is some degree of truth to that. And I think that Bolaño is very cogent of, again, I don't know if he actually knew anyone who was like a real serial killer or anything like that, but I'm sure he knew people who were in like literary circles with him who ended up supporting Pinochet, perhaps informed on people or did like bad things, and somehow like brought it, either tried to pretend that was somehow separate from their artistic work, or in fact that they were doing good somehow in doing it. And I think that the fact that he is willing to like deal with like how these things actually manifest in people's lives, instead of, again, treating fascism as, again, it's evil. It's like this ultimate evil, but it is not this inhuman thing. It's something that's deeply human, deeply tied up in human drives, human society. It's not an aberration. It's an extension of things that we subliminate, like you said. In the same way that art is.
And so like, and this is a good transition. So then the next chapter is the killings aren't as public as they might end up being, but suddenly Vitor starts writing poems in the sky using a World War II airplane. And there's like this really like fraught scene where Bolaño's in prison, where he doesn't tell us why, presumably because he was a leftist. And he's like standing in the courtyard and everyone is like looking up at an airplane that's writing in the sky. And everyone like stops talking. And Bolaño writes the scene as this kind of like incredibly fraught bit. And there's a guy that everyone knows is the crazy guy. At which point Bolaño says, and I wanted to circle back on this. Bolaño says, the narrator, there high above the city, he began to write a poem in the sky. At first I thought the pilot had gone mad, and I wasn't surprised. Madness was not exceptional at the time, given that Pinochet is in charge. But then Madge and Roberto, who is one of the prisoners who's mad, when they see the plane, it's a Messerschmitt 109, a Messerschmitt fighter from the Luftwaffe, the best fighter plane of 1940. And Mad Roberto, climbing the fence like a monkey, says, the Second World War is returning to the Earth. All that talk about the Third World War was wrong. It's the second returning. And it has fallen to us, the people of Chile, to greet and welcome it. Oh, lucky day, he cried. And like, obviously, like he is the mad prisoner, but the idea that like World War II is returning, like, yeah, John's smiling from ear to ear. like the Nazis are coming back. Like, yeah, they all fled to South America after World War II, and now they're flying in the sky writing poems. And like, one, I like that Bolaño says madness was not exceptional at that time. Like the idea of like in an authoritarian coup, people would just spontaneously go crazy. Like that to me scans as a true observation. And two, the fact that he's doing this in an airplane as sort of like a the evils of the history are still here and we haven't gotten over them and they're back, basically.
Yeah, that section got me thinking a lot about Adorno.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And this is something I don't know if I brought up on the show before, Ben, but I know you and I have talked about it before, and I obviously like both of them, but I'm much more of like an Adorno guy than a oh my gosh, no, not Horkheimer, the guy who committed suicide.
Walter Benjamin.
Yeah. Oh
yeah.
my God.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm much more like I love Benjamin, great theorist, great writer, blah blah. Don't need to defend him here, but I'm much more of like a Adorno guy. I think Adorno is more interesting from the standpoint that Adorno like lived through Nazism and then lived through what came after World War II.
Right.
And, you know, the fact that he is like so bitter and so acerbic, the fact that minimum moralia is the way that it is, you know, I think a lot about how it must have felt to be like a person who was aware enough to see like, oh, like the Third Reich, they're just importing all those people to South America or, you know, literally into the United States, like via stuff like Operation Paperclip, which I don't know if he knew about that officially, but just like the fact that the West German state like is very obviously being run by people who are part of the Nazi government. Like the way that like we flipped on a dime and like all of a sudden the Soviets became the great Satan after they had basically won that part of the war for us. I think about how that must have made people who were aware of what was going on feel insane. And the ways in which like we've never fully dealt with the problem of like, we didn't denazify Germany. We, in fact, Nazified the entire world. And yeah, in some ways, Chile was one of the kind of premier re-Nazification moments of global history.
And like it should be said, the U.S. was heavily involved in installing Pinochet, like to ensure interests in South America. Like, and also Adorno talks about like, and with Horkheimer, how like, yeah, the liberal subject has like latency for fascism and that it's no like defense of fascism to just assume it'll be fine with democracy. And that like, you need to be aware of what happens, you know? Yeah, and like, and the fact that Bolaño is able to kind of conjure this in like what is a sort of psychologically fraught scene in which a bunch of people watch a guy write a poem in the sky. Also, I want to note that the poem that he writes in the sky is the Latin beginning of the book of Genesis, which those Chilean Christian nationalists must have loved. Like, it's to just see like the book of Genesis get written in the sky in Latin as one of Vider's first skywriting poems.
Well, it's interesting because again, there's the bit after the murderer where he says, as if to prove Carlos Vider was not a god.
Yeah.
And the fact that he is literally inscribing the words of Genesis like in the sky
Right.
is this way in which this man's poetic voice again is this outsized, like egoistic, murderous, narcissism.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And so basically later, in the next chapter, it sort of like tracks Vider's rise in popularity after he does these acts, and he starts doing more airplane flying stuff. He flies to the South Pole. I wanted to note, I talked about John this earlier, he receives a sort of sterling recommendation by a one Father Ibache, or I think it's Father, hold on, it's Father
Nicasio Ibacache?
Yeah, Ibacache, yeah, who is essentially Urrutia LaCroix, and he says, read, my boy, which is like such a like a stereotype advice from someone. And like this guy, like again, in By Night in Chile, he was like an Opus Dei member. And if it's the same character, which I think it is, it's like, yeah, one sort of hoity-toity fascist far-right guy sort of saluting another one.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's interesting too with the skywriting is it's this way where, again, like, what's this guy's like angle? Like, you very much get the impression like, yes, this is like something he wants to do, but it's also like this thing, it's the spectacle that is meant to kind of fixate like the Chilean public, and particularly kind of the intellectual, like literati set of the Chilean public, like get them looking at that. Don't get them looking at any of this other stuff we're doing.
Yeah, like bread and circus type stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this thing that is, again, like the poetry that he writes in the sky is pretty pedestrian, I think it's easy to say.
Well, except for the one that he writes before the photography thing, which is like kind of horrifying, but we can wait to get to that. So,
I mean, well, again, I think that it can be both.
Yeah.
It's horrifying because of the context it's in. I don't know that it's actually like written, like it's meant to be like a great poem, like on a craft level, so to speak. I mean, it's Bolaño writing it, so it's still probably kind of, but kind of in fiction. The fact that he's writing this stuff like with an airplane, I think is very much kind of this man is not actually like a talented writer or poet. He's a propagandist and a provocateur, but that's what he can do, and so he does it. It scratches the same itch for him. And again, the fact that it's useful to people in power means that people are made to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
Both by just kind of the physical act itself of, again, writing in the sky, particularly like outside of prison camp where the people can't look away.
Yeah, and they were thrown in there for like, just dumb reasons, like associated with leftists or something.
And then the kind of attention economy aspect where, the kind of critical establishment won't stop talking about how like cool and interesting this is.
Yeah, see, John, you had mentioned sort of like phone news, and I imagine like in this, like, again, I'm thinking about how this was like, the critical establishment was talking about him. There's airplanes doing this weird stuff in the sky, and that was just kind of like what people had to deal with at the time. And I think Bolaño kind of captures how like yeah, how it could be like psychologically devastating and confusing and like just sort of like, yeah, just fucked up. So
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot about that for obvious reasons again, but as long as I think about like the ways in which we are forced to pay attention to certain things, uh, you know, I know far more about Taylor Swift than I should have to. I haven't listened to a Taylor Swift album in probably 10 years. And yet, like, just because of the way that like social media algorithms are set up, the kind of behavior from like fans that these things, support, like if you live in like modern American society, you are forced to know a great deal about Taylor Swift. And I'm not even saying like Taylor Swift is fascist, but the architecture of like the media ecosystem like is much more like powerful than I think we realize. And the fact that it can be tweaked and kind of pulled in different directions by powerful players. I mean, again, not to get too into recent politics, but I really do think that there is a way that you can draw a line from Elon Musk buying Twitter, however many years ago that was, to the recent election. Obviously it's not the only factor there,
right.
But the creation of like a right-wing echo chamber that all of a sudden a bunch of people who weren't exposed to this stuff all of a sudden are, again, like I have been on Twitter. I don't think anyone here who's on Twitter doesn't know what I'm talking about. The fact that like all of a sudden there's all these like literal like bots that are just set up to like retweet Nazi memes that get boosted by the algorithm.
Like, they all have blue checks. They're all getting paid to they have AI generated banners. Yeah, it's like
it's not that's not for nothing.
Yeah.
And as much as we like to think of art as, again, kind of the highest thing in human life, or this thing that can even transcend like human existence in a lot of ways, it does exist like in these material contexts of like politics and base superstructure.
yeah
and that can't be ignored. And I think that, again, much like the prisoners in the yard cannot ignore the skywriting over the mountains, I think that Bolaño is kind of making us confront the way in which art is used as propaganda, as a distraction from what is happening in the world.
Yeah.
Like, I think that is kind of what this book is about in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And also I would say, like you were talking about, political effects. I think the way this book kind of, after this, like before we find more about Vider, opens up into like the life of Chilean expats is really fascinating, because as you said, like politics does affect you as an artist, what kind of art you make, just normal people. But like we get like these stories of like the two workshop teachers that they attended, De Soto and Juan Stein. We get a story of another Chilean expat named Lorenzo or Petra. And then technically Carlos Vider is an expat, although we'll get to why he is later. But like, yeah, there's like a very, like, literature doesn't just happen in a vacuum. We don't just come up with like airy flights of fancy. And like politics is almost like always there. And whether it's for a distraction or as a cause or an effect, that depends on what kind of art you're looking at.
Yeah. One of my favorite chapters in the book is one that comes pretty soon after this. And it is the one about Stein. And he's describing his veneration for this Soviet general, Ivan Chernyakhovsky, who's like he's distantly related to.
Yeah, he's like third cousin, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's kind of this very interesting thing where he talks about, you know, why he thinks this guy was such a great general. And I mean, based on what he says, you know, it seems like this guy was pretty heroic. But kind of the ways in which this very distant relationship really informs like this guy's artistic outlook, his political outlook. Crucially, like out of everyone that the book follows, he does not really take the coup like lying down. I mean, he manages to avoid being arrested or killed, and he becomes like a leftist fighter, like out in the jungles, like doing guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, they track him to different countries. They're like, oh, now he's in El Salvador. Now he's in Bolivia. Yeah, like, and he's like he's like a guerrilla fighter. But what did you think of the ending of that story?
So that is kind of the interesting thing there too, is that the guy goes to like his hometown, and somehow this guy who he has heard has like been a guerrilla fighter and all this. He actually did not do any of that, and he joined like quote unquote like silent left, which I guess were just people who hid, and then died of cancer like a couple of years after the coup. And I didn't quite know what to make of that,
because they try to find his grave. He's like, I'm going to find the grave of the Juan Stein who didn't leave Chile, and they can't find him.
That's kind of like the fact that they can't find the grave feels important to me. And I guess like my thing with it is that, again, Bolaño's definitely like I mean, there's a reason he put it in this book. This book does not have enough fat for this to be like pointless. But I don't quite know what to make of it. It's this thing where I was trying to figure out, like, did the government like either say he was a guerrilla fighter and he never was, or did they say he died of cancer, like to kind of try to like undercut this guy's like reputation? And I couldn't quite make out like what the intention was. And
well, I have a quote here
go ahead.
About this that I think is worth reading. So I think in this Stein story, Chernyakhovsky is paired with William Carlos Williams, and there's a bit where
I forgot about that.
Yeah, he has a picture of William Carlos Williams, and they're like, "Why do you have a picture of William Carlos Williams? Like, he's just going about his job as a doctor, and like, why don't you have a picture of like somebody more attractive?" And Juan Stein says, "I just like it," said Stein. "I like to think it is William Carlos Williams," because they're like, maybe it's not him. But most of all, he added after a while, by which date we had already got on to Gramsci, "I like its tranquility. The idea that Williams is going about his business, walking unhurriedly down a calm street to make a house call." And later still, when we were talking about poetry in the Paris Commune, he said very softly, "I don't know, but I don't think anyone heard." Which is like, so I think the fact that William Carlos Williams is paired with Chernyakhovsky is like, for Juan Stein, this particular character of the expat that Bolaño is exploring, there's like a superposition of leftist extreme guerrilla fighter, guy who goes about his business, and like both of those are like equally important. And I think Juan Stein is presented as oscillating between the two. And so, like, for instance, for Bibiano, Ryan, and Arturo Bolaño, they really need to hear that he was a guerrilla fighter to sort of go about their days doing like their own lives. And again, Bibiano Ryan didn't leave Chile. He stayed and worked at like a shoe repair shop, and he corresponded with all these authors from his office, whereas Arturo Bolaño fled to Spain, which is what actually Bolaño did. And so I think the idea of like Juan Stein is like this superposition of like, you can either fight it and be like a superhero guerrilla fighter, or just kind of do it, like just go about your day. And I think he's like in both at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I also definitely get the impression that a big part of it is that Arturo Bolaño, the narrator, I don't get the impression that like he feels somewhat cowardly for having fled the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that poem Bertolt Brecht wrote about like leaving people in Germany to flee because of the Nazis.
Yeah, and obviously like a little different because he actually did like get arrested and like get his life ruined by the Pinochet regime.
Yeah,
but I think that maybe the thing is like, oh, I could have done otherwise. Like either I could have taken one of these two paths, which are both kind of in their own ways courageous, but instead I chose to be a coward. And I think that the whole kind of back half of the book is really him working through like what it meant to leave, and like, is there a way that act of leaving can be redeemed?
Yeah, and that's sort of like that dovetails nicely with the detective plot. So
yes.
Yeah. I also want to touch, if we're talking expats, I just want to touch on DeSoto. DeSoto is like the guy that gets the nice family set up in Paris. And there's a nice bit that DeSoto was always translating people that nobody wanted to read. And that DeSoto had to leave Chile because everybody thought he was too good for Chile. They thought he was uppity because he knew so much. It's sort of like a kind of thing that like Bolaño gets in there. Like, yeah, people can hate you, and given the opportunity, they might think you're like, they want to level them, like they want to make themselves higher than you. And it has to do with like DeSoto liking, foreign poets. But anyway, he goes to Paris. He has a family. He has a nice university lecturer job. But then Bolaño says, but the curse caught up with him. And he's attending like a conference. He sees a woman getting assaulted by neo-Nazis. He steps in to save the woman. The neo-Nazis stab him. He dies. So that's like the fate of like the other expat, is to sort of not escape the curse of authoritarianism and like, yeah, what happened in your country.
Yeah, I mean, I almost got the impression too with that scene. Like, I don't think Bolaño like comes out and says like, oh, like he was targeted, like this was an op.
Yeah.
But I definitely like, it kind of felt that way to me. There's kind of an eeriness to the situation that makes it feel op-ish.
Like this is the convenient, it's like the convenient explanation is what happened. Yeah.
Yeah. The conference is also crucially like he's going back to South America, if I remember correctly.
I think so. Yeah.
And so it's kind of this thing where, in some ways, like he's almost like trying to repeat the trauma in miniature, where it's like, oh, I fled the first time, but this time I'm going to go save this woman from these Nazis, and that's going to kind of be the stand-in for the fact that I left, and then it doesn't work.
Yeah, and so like, well, and then the last one that we should mention is Lorenzo, who comes immediately after that one as sort of like a happier story. But I just wanted to mention the line, the way it wraps up. There was a brief article in the Catalonian newspapers, but Bibiano told me all about it in a very detailed letter, almost like a detective's report. It was the last letter I received from him. So like, yeah, just the way that trails off. But then Lorenzo is introduced as like the last one. And he lost both his arms in a freak accident. And he's also gay. And so in order to cope with that, he becomes an artist. And Lorenzo basically becomes like a street traveler performing artist in various European countries. He, basically makes enough money there that he becomes sort of like semi-famous, and there are like newspaper interviews with him, and it's described that Arturo Bolaño is like in a hospital basically like reading the interviews of Lorenzo and just laughing and crying and having like a great time basically. And so Lorenzo is kind of presented as like a happier story, although Lorenzo dies of AIDS. And so like there's like this array of expats that were presented, and Arturo says at the end here, sometimes when I think of Stein and Soto, I can't help thinking of Lorenzo too. Sometimes I think he was the best poet of the three, but usually I see them all together. And now, John, I wanted to ask you this. The way this ends, he mentions that all three of them read basically one of the founding texts of Gestalt therapy. What did you think about that? So as it says at the end of this expat story, they all read one book. The book was called Ma Gestalt Therapie, and its author, Dr. Frederick S. Perls, was a psychiatrist, a fugitive from Nazi Germany, and a wanderer on 3 continents. As far as I know, it hasn't been published in Spain. And it just ends, which is a great little like dark twist. But what did you think of the fact that they've all read Gestalt therapy by this particular figure?
Yeah, So I don't know a lot about Gestalt therapy, like in and of itself. So I can't give too many specifics there. But for me, I feel like it's about being an individual, like living in history.
Yeah.
You know, I have been, little peek inside the kimono. I have been seeing an analyst for the last couple months, and there is this kind of division you find yourself in, like as like I like to think of myself as a politically conscious person, pursuing like therapy. It is this thing that can kind of make you feel very narcissistic. You're kind of focusing on your own problems to the exclusion of like larger problems in this way that can feel very disorienting or selfish. And I feel like there is this thing here where, again, these are all people who they got out.
Yeah.
They escaped from the political horrors of the Pinochet regime, and they've all more or less found some kind of stability abroad. But like that trauma stays.
Yeah.
Like the trauma of getting fucking kidnapped off the street by a fascist government and put in a prison camp. Like I can't, like I've been trying to work through my own shit, and that has nothing on that.
Yeah, yeah.
But like, what else can you do when there's seemingly no like material outlet for the position you find yourself in?
Yeah.
Like, these people are living in Europe. They're literally in a different like hemisphere than everyone they knew and lost, and the people who did whatever they did to them. But they cannot help but try to mend that trauma. And it's this way again where the forces of history like are these things that we, for better or worse, like experience as individuals. Like no one experiences any historical event like as the like again like no one in the Soviet Revolution like actually experienced the revolution as like this empty vessel for the spirit of the working class. That's not how these things work. No one in Pinochet's Chile like experienced the fascist uprising as this being possessed by the historical force of fascism. There are a lot of people who try to do that, but that's in fact just a form of neurosis. All politics eventually coming back to sexual pathology, of course,
as they do. Yeah.
But we experience these things as individual conscious beings. And that means that we try to seek meaning, we try to seek healing, we try to seek some kind of understanding, even when there is none to be found. And to me, that's what that book is. Again, I don't know enough about Gestalt therapy there could be something totally different going on there that I just am ignorant of the topic to describe. But at least to me, that's what it felt like. Because you have these three people with very similar but also very different lives, and they're all kind of trying to make sense of being the lucky people, the people who didn't get pushed out of a helicopter.
Yeah, and I'm picking up what you're putting down, John, and I actually looked up the Gestalt therapy prayer, which he wrote, I believe, after this book that Bolaño referenced. But does this sound like what you're saying? I do my thing and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you and I am I. And if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an element where that almost feels like a little cute.
Which I think
of
it's
like what we're talking about, but I
Yeah.
think that makes sense given the context.
And like he obviously got criticized for that in ways like I think you're gesturing towards with it being too cute and pat. But I think like that's an interesting sort of approach. Yeah, it's like forces of history, but I'm also here. I'm an individual and I'm living through this. Like, how do I do that?
Yeah, yeah.
After kind of covering these expat stories, Bolaño, the author, brings us back to the sort of final days of vida in Chile with the disastrous photography exhibition, where he basically shows to everyone all of the photographs of the dead female poets he's killed. In another scene of incredible mounting dread and horrifying sort of implication. Now, there's one particular detail, John, I'd like to mention that I sort of got weirdly obsessed with. So the account of the photography exhibition is actually not Arturo Bolaño's own, but one that he's drawing upon from a lieutenant general who was in the Pinochet military, who was there at this exhibition. And the guy who sort of walked in and viewed the photographs. And without going into detail, I just want to mention one to you. One of the details is we're told that one of the photographs is featuring the cover of a book. Much like with Gestalt therapy, there's another book that's referenced, and that book specifically is, so a photo showing the cover of a book by Joseph de Maistre, the St. Petersburg Dialogues. Now, if you were to, like me, look up the St. Petersburg Dialogues, the St. Petersburg Dialogues appear to be an entire theological argumentative treatise about how, one, the Enlightenment was bad, two, God is the establishment of all moral law, and three, sacrifice, specifically blood sacrifice, is intrinsically good. And this was written by an insane French diplomat, a conservative Christian, a Scottish Rite Mason. And it's like 1,000 pages. And if you look it up on Goodreads, all of the accounts who reviewed it have tradcath coded accounts like, oh, poor humble Johannes, or I am a St. Petersburg man. And they're all just like, what a genius, what a man. Now, John, you might ask yourself, what does this actually sound like? And I have one quote that I have selected at random. And by that, I mean not random. Thus, from the maggot up to man, the universal law of the violent destruction of living things is unceasingly fulfilled. The entire earth, perpetually steeped in blood, is nothing but an immense altar on which every living thing must be immolated without end, without restraint, without respite, until the consummation of the world, until the extinction of evil, until the death of death.
In the grim darkness of the 41st millennia, there is only war.
I wonder if actually Cormac McCarthy read that for Judge Holden, because a lot of the book actually sounds like Judge Holden. Anyway, I find it, one, fascinating that Bolaño put this book into the art exhibition of the insane psychopath, and two, that it's like a tradcath apologist book. And if you read the intro, John, it's never a good sign when the guy who's putting together a collection by theorists goes, I don't think this guy is insane as everyone thinks he's insane. And he's not that obsessed with blood. Like, that's literally the tone of the introduction, John, for the St. Petersburg, this book, the St. Petersburg Dialogue. Anyway, I feel like I've gone down this rabbit hole far enough. But
I would say, fellow book fags, this guy, probably a bad guy, but look up this author, Joseph Marie Comte de Maistre, kind of a hottie. I'm looking at a lovely sketch of him, very strong jawline.
Yeah, it's also weird to me that tradcasts are like, what a genius, smart book, when it appears to be just like, it's anti-enlightenment, John. It's
of a madman.
Yeah, it's like it's also like weirdly like Adorno, like the Enlightenment, like it's anti-enlightenment, but in a way that like is just all about religion. I don't know. It's an insane detail to just kind of drop in the middle of the art exhibit. That's all I had to say about that. Anything you wanted to say about the art exhibition scene, which is, I think, sufficiently dreadful. So, like, in a way, like, not horrible, but like full of dread.
Someone who's been to a lot of gallery openings, I've been to worse.
What did you think about his dad's there? And his dad's like, yeah, this is fine.
I'll say it again. I've been to a lot of gallery openings. I've been to worse. Everybody's dad says that.
So the Chilean Secret Service shows up. They clean up everything, and that's the last anyone sees of Carlos Vidar in Chile again. At which point we're treated to a rambling digression. One of my favorite parts of Bolaño. It's almost exactly like Pierre Menard, as you said, John. Like, here's a bibliography of a made-up author. Here's the bibliography of Carlos Vidar, in which he gets involved in horrible plays, dreadful, in this sense, bad poetry, war games, as well as a sort of side interlude into the Philip K. Dick Society from an American named Graham Greenwood, which is a very funny, like, Graham Greene reference.
My hair stood up on end like an angry cat when I read that, because I hate that man.
You hate Graham Greene?
Yeah. This has been a running thing on the show.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah. Graham Greene, R.I.P. Bozo. Yeah. Didn't like Noel Coward. Now he's in the Philip K. Dick Society. Yeah, like, Graham Greene also, like, maybe a spy as well. Maybe you've heard that theory.
Yeah, spook.
Yeah, so what did you think of the bibliography section, as I'm going to call it, like Carlos Vidar's collected works?
So, like I said, the first work of Bolaño I ever read was Nazi Literature in the Americas, and this book is, it's basically a spin-off of that work. There's the last entry of that book is basically an entry on Carlos Vidar, more or less, and I think again it's Bolaño kind of. He's, again, kind of one of these guys where I feel like there are a lot of these kind of people on the left, but there's kind of this fascination with right-wing culture.
Yeah.
And just how bizarre it can appear from the outside. The fact that, it's so wrapped up in stuff like war games and science fiction, and really pedestrian seeming kind of fare, in addition to kind of very pretentious stuff on the other end. And Bolaño is clearly someone who, like, he I'm sure read the entirety of the St. Petersburg dialogues. Like, this guy knows, like, right-wing culture, even if he would vociferously disagree with it. But there is something just fascinating. I quoted earlier after you read the quote from the St. Petersburg dialogues, I quoted the opening lines to every work of Warhammer 40K writing. And there is this element with right-wing art where it is fascinating on a level. Like, it's fascinating that there are people who read about the Imperium of Man from the Warhammer 40K universe, and they say, I'll take some of that, please. And the fact that this game that has, was invented by a bunch of like coked up, like, British dorks, like, who are all hopped up on like heavy metal and Tolkien novels, and like wanted to kind of like make fun of Margaret Thatcher, like the fact that this stuff has been embraced like as unironic, like an unironic vision of like a positive future by huge swaths of right-wing people is fascinating, and also like cringe, and also terrifying. I feel like Bolaño is kind of diagnosing whatever that strange strain in kind of the right-wing literati is.
Yeah, it's like violent sentimentality or something. Like, it's it's like if kitsch wanted to beat you up.
But it's also this thing with Vidar where I think it's also, he does have this terrifying like desire to create. Like, this guy has an output that is genuinely I'll just say like in terms of just like the word count he must have been putting out, like makes me feel jealous. And I think Bolaño is someone who clearly is very kind of familiar with this voracious need to write both economically, but also just kind of spiritually. I think it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, where he recognizes the creative act not as an unalloyed good, but as a, you know, a human drive that, like all human drives, like can be channeled towards different ends.
Yeah.
And in this case, towards really horrifying, violent, fucked up ends, and also really bad ends artistically.
Yeah, I just want to note this description of the war game, which made me laugh out loud. The game covered the whole duration of the War of the Pacific, which broke out in 1879 between Chile and the alliance of Peru and Bolivia, each turn corresponding to a period of 2 weeks. More fun than Monopoly, claimed the advertising, although it was soon apparent to the players that there was a good deal more to the game than mere fun. And then, like, without reading the whole thing, there's an incredible aside where it says there was in addition a third level to the game, which concerned the ordinary men who swelled the ranks of the victorious Chilean army as it marched undefeated to Lima, and the secret meeting that was held in a small underground church dating from colonial times. A meeting which supposedly marked the foundation in the Peruvian capital of what various authors with more or less stylistic felicity but a common sense of the acerb have ventured to call the Chilean race. So the idea that Chileans were formed in Peru, which is like ethno-nationalism, is just like the third secret layer of this war game. Yeah, crazy.
I loved that bit. I again, one of my favorite artistic moves, and I don't know if we've talked about it on the show before, is this kind of ekphrastic move where you describe like a piece of art that physically could not exist, you know, Ode to a Grecian Urn style. And I'd love to play this game if it was real, but I don't know how it would function. And I love the way that Bolaño is able to make this feel very plausible while also describing a thing that if you try to think through how it would actually work, just does not make logical sense.
Yeah. The board game description just sort of like bottoms out in a series of unanswerable questions. like, yeah, it's like, how could this happen? You know, so
it's like if the glass bead game was fucked up.
Yeah. So yeah, then the Philip K. Dick Society, where that guy sounds like a one of the paranoid American, you know, like crazy people, basically, Graham Greenwood, and then. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty. Oh, and then Ibakache shows up again. And I love the description of where he's sort of interviewing Vitor over the telephone. And he says something like, he pointed out that Vitor, whose voice at the other end of the telephone line sounded like wind and rain, and this from a man who collected antiques should be taken literally, knew the dialogue of a man with his soul and made a careful study of 'Tis a Pity She's a Whore by John Ford, whose complete works, including those written in collaboration, he had annotated in detail. Ever the skeptic, Bibbiano thought it more likely that Vitor's familiarity with Ford was limited to the Italian film based on his best-known play, which came out in Latin America in 1973 or thereabouts. The fragment concerning the erudition of the promising poet Carlos Vitor broke off abruptly, as if Ibakache had suddenly realized he was stepping into a void. So like it's just like, oh, I shouldn't talk to Vitor anymore. So anyway, that section ends, and we sort of come back around to Arturo Bolaño, who is in Spain, and this is the entrance of the detective, whose character name is Abel Romero.
Yeah, I will say, a little disappointed in Bolaño here doing propaganda, showing a cop being a good person. Very problematic.
Well, see, John, I think he also kind of captures like cops are a little pathetic. No,
I was being sarcastic.
Oh, okay. Where he's like, he solved 2 murders and he was once given a medal by Allende, but he lost it.
No, he's one of the people's cops. He's good. He's great. Yeah. I'm a big favor of the people's cops.
I also like at one point, like when they're talking about the barbaric writings, Arturo feels sorry for the leader, and Abel goes, "I can't feel sorry for those people." Like,
yeah, you want me to feel bad for a sicko?
Yeah, hell no. Yeah.
But more or less, this police officer, this detective, has come to Spain. He is on the hunt for Viter, and he knows that Bolaño is a former acquaintance of Viter's and is living in Spain. And so he kind of tracks him down and is like, "Hey, can you help me like bring this guy to justice?" More or less. Like, he's not like there as like a member of Interpol or something, but he's more or less, it seems like he's there. He's like, I help me find this guy so I can murder him.
Yeah, and to catch a poet, we need a poet, is what he says, basically. Yeah. And I like, too, that Abel is kind of an expat, but he's going to take the money that he's going to get for killing Viter and, like, open up a business in Chile. Like, that's... And, like, Arturo says, like, all the Chileans I know are going back or trying to open up a business or something. Like, he says that, like, offhandedly.
I mean, they're very friendly to small business policies.
Yeah, so and so then we get this tracking sequence. John, what do you think of the scene where both of them sit down for a nice porno? because it's revealed that Carlos Viter was sort of like a second cameraman on some incredibly fucked up porno movies, and somehow they need to watch these in order to like identify Viter. What did you think about that?
I mean, my kind of read on it is so I think kind of the idea that this detective has, and I don't know that there's any real merit to it, but I think he's basically like trying to be like, oh, we're gonna like do Will Graham like super empathy by reading all this guy's writing and like what, like basically consuming like every piece of art that he did. We're going to like understand his mind and be able to like track him.
You've played these war games, haven't you, my man?
But I mean, I think it's this thing where again, the question I think that this section is asking, maybe the whole book is asking, is again like, can the act of fleeing be justified, be redeemed?
Yeah.
Can that guilt be expurgated somehow? That's what this whole hunt is about. I mean, like you said, the Abel has some kind of connection where he's going to make a lot of money by killing Viter. He has some kind of, connection who wants him dead, and he's decided to throw in with that to get revenge. But it's also this thing where it's like, this guy is, for them, he is symbolic of the evil that destroyed their lives. And so they're trying, the hope is that by killing him, they have, they will purge the guilt because they will have killed the devil. And in doing that, redeem themselves by doing this thing that, no one else could have done.
And like Arturo is like sort of energized by this too. Like it's sort of described.
He seems to love like reading all this guy's stuff and like trying to like get in his head. But it's also this thing where like this is like a trauma repetition in a way. Like they're kind of like this. They kind of watching the porno kind of feels like this thing where they need to like watch something ugly. Like to really like again, because all the other stuff, it's like it's kind of stupid and boorish and I'm sure gross, but it's got this kind of kitschy element to it that probably kind of makes it almost a little funny. Whereas I feel like the porno, it's this thing where it's like we have to see like how abject this guy was. We have to remind ourselves like how evil this guy was. There's intimations that the whole crew, except Viter, everyone who like worked on this pornography set, it was on like a weird island somewhere financed by a shadowy financier. And like everyone who like was in it or worked on it, like ended up dead, like under mysterious circumstances, except Viter.
Right.
And so to me, it really read as this thing where it's like, okay, they're looking at like the worst of the worst in a way. Like they're really trying to remind themselves like that this guy is not a cartoon character, like he's actually evil.
Yeah, and I like too that the porno is twinned with the barbaric writing, in which like you can write if you smear the classics with shit, as I mentioned earlier. And then Vider is sort of salivating at this prospect because it means the abolishment of all literature, which I think is a great kind of end goal for the frustrated artist Vider, where like, if I can't write, I will ensure that all writing is ruined. And then Arturo goes, there he is. Like, and that's sort of like like, that's the Vider I know. Like, and so like, so then basically Abel's like, I need you to identify Vider at this cafe. And John, I don't know about you, but I was actually thinking about the beginning of Longlegs, where they're in this like endless urban sprawl, and one of them's like, yeah, the killer's in one of these houses, and like they're described as like this empty tourist town. There's like a reproduction bar that's described as a fossilized bird. And like there's all of these soulless houses, and like in one of them is Vider. Like, and I was just like weirdly thinking about the beginning of Longlegs, which I think was the best part of the movie, was like that initial like urban sprawl scene. But so then basically they're sitting at the table. Bolaño's reading a book, which is the collected works of Bruno Schultz, which I won't get into, but he was a Polish writer who was killed by the Gestapo. But anyway, so he's reading that book. Vider sits down, and I thought this quote was interesting. Bolaño says, when seeing Vider, he seemed to be going through a rough patch. He had the face of a man who knows how to wait without losing his nerve or letting his imagination run wild. He didn't look like a poet. He didn't look as if he had been an officer in the Chilean Air Force. He didn't look like an infamous killer. He didn't look like a man who had flown to Antarctica to write a poem in the sky. Not at all. So yeah, like Vider's just kind of like ruined, and he's like a guy who's been waiting. And so he indicates to Abel that this happens, and they're sort of like going their separate ways. And I thought this thing that Abel says in trying to justify what they're about to do to Vider, or what Abel is, he says, as to whether he'll do any more harm, all I can say is we don't know. We can't know. You're not God, and nor am I. We're only doing what we can. That's all. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell by the voice emanating from his rock still silhouette that he was making an effort to be convincing. So it's sort of like, we can't know. This is what I'm doing. And I think it's going to help, and it's going to help me, and it's going to help you too, basically. But like, I also like that like Arturo feels like this weird kind of like, I don't know if we should be doing this moment kind of as it's happening. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that how I read it is that he sees Vider and he realizes like, oh, it's not the devil. Like this guy, yeah, he was evil. He did all these evil things, but he's just a guy. Like killing him is not going to undo anything. It's not going to fix anything.
Yeah.
It's not so much like, all violence is wrong or anything like that, but it's just this thing where like, this isn't going to help me. It's not going to do anything. Like, this is just, it's pointless. Like, it's not even like revenge just becomes unappealing in a way that like becomes unappealing in the way that like eating like an over microwave slice of pizza does.
Yeah.
But again, I think that it's this thing where it's Bolaño, I think, kind of maybe owning up to the idea that like running can't be redeemed because maybe like there is no redemption in history. There's no right or wrong in a lot of ways. Like there's not like there's no one to redeem this. Like there's no cosmic justice you can find in these situations. You just have to, I don't know what you have to do. Actually, I don't know that he comes down on like what you should or shouldn't do. Aside from probably don't be a fascist.
Well, I think it kind of comes to what you're saying, John, because the last paragraph of the book is dreadful, repeated Romero as if he were savoring the word. Then he laughed quietly, grinning like a rabbit, and said, well, what else could it have been? I wasn't in a laughing mood, but I laughed all the same. Romero looked at the sky, at the lighted windows, the car headlights, the neon signs, and he seemed small and tired. Soon I guessed he would be 60, and I had already passed 40. A taxi pulled up beside us. Look after yourself, my friend, he said, and off he went. But yeah, like the idea of like, what else would it have been is sort of just like this is how it has to end. Like, this is the way that historical events have played out. And there's this sort of like darkness there, but also a sort of like morbid humor. Sort of like, here we are. We just ended up doing this. Like the trauma's kind of repeated itself. It's played out the way it has to. And as you said, John, yeah, he's like not the demon. He's just like a guy.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's this thing where this is kind of what I think, these are both guys who have more or less kind of, who had at some point kind of left-wing political leanings, or at least, I don't know if Abel was like officially ever said to be like a socialist, but who was happy enough like working under a socialist government, right? And was not happy like working under a fascist one. And it's this thing where, again, like there's no like what there's nothing else for them to do. Like there's no there's no productive channel for these energies. I think that even with Vitor, that's kind of what happens to him. Like he wants to, he spends his youth trying to find a way to kill literature, and kind of having this individualistic, heroic like vision of himself as this iconoclast who's going to upend, human civilization more or less by, participating in this coup. And, I think that that's always the thing with fascism that I find fascinating is it's this thing where it's all about like the fantasy of yourself as a hero or as a heroic individual. And then, what do you do with that when you get old and you can't maintain that vision of yourself? And I think that's why so many fascists like end up in, death squads where they're basically just committing violence until they have to be put down like rabid dogs, or, or
they like, flame out. Yeah.
Yeah. So. You flame out, or you go, kind of insane in this really like kind of depressive way because you can't maintain the fantasy anymore. And I think that like these are three men who all wanted something at one point in their lives. Some of those things were good, some of those things were bad, depending on the person we're talking about. And all of their lives have kind of come out to nothing. Even all the Pinochet regime, for all the kind of pomp and circumstances behind it, what did it actually accomplish? Chile is not like I guess from the standpoint that there are still the business is still open for American extractive industries. It accomplished that, but like if you wanted anything more than that, which presumably a lot of kind of the foot soldiers of it did, like you don't have much to show for it. Chile is not like a great power or anything like that. We're kind of to go back to By Night in Chile, like there's no, no one's reading Father Rukia. There's no great Chilean literature that's, supplanted any other national literature on the world stage. Not to say there aren't good Chilean writers. We're reading one right now. But he says he's waiting, and he's been waiting all this time for this fantasy to come true, and there's just no way for it to. And all that's left then is just kind of the petty, stupid violence of individual lives bumping against each other.
Yeah, and that image of him just being in like an abandoned bar in like a lonely tourist town is like, very striking.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's one of like kind of the most haunting images of the book. I mean, again, not a good guy, but man, imagine you were like one of the key like propaganda officers for the Pinochet regime, and then you're just living in some fucking depressing Spanish suburb and like hanging out at like a lame bar. And what did you do any of that for? Yeah. It's horrifying.
Yeah. And so then I like that there's this sort of like take care of yourself at the end there between the detective and Arturo. But like, it just sort of ends with a nice drop off. Like it's sort of like, and now what? And like, just kind of ends. Like, so.
Yeah, well, he deliberately chooses to exit the plot, such as it is.
Yeah.
And he decides that he's not going to, I don't even want to say if it's perpetuating a cycle, but he's just not going to do this. Yeah. He's going to find a different way to get through life. And again, and I like that Bolaño has the courage to not necessarily say like, this isn't like necessarily a heroic act. This isn't necessarily like an act of unalloyed goodness on his part or like charity. It's like looking at an overcooked piece of pizza. Like it's just, I would prefer not.
Well, yeah, and I like that. Yeah, it's a nice like, and it's that section is written in such like a tense, like dread building style, and then there's this kind of nice little anticlimax where it's like,
yeah.
Now that's over. Like, so.
Well, I think that's I don't want to say it's all of Bolaño, but I feel like that's something Bolaño does really well because again, the monster in Bolaño is not anything that can actually ever be unveiled like that. There's never going to be a scene where the mask is pulled off and we see again like Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep like has been the bad guy all along. The villain in Bolaño is the system that we all live in and participate in, and it's too big for us to grasp.
Yeah.
And so, we can never get that moment of full catharsis. We can just get these glimpses behind the curtain. And in some ways, that's far more disturbing.
Yeah. And I don't know, John, it seems like a good place to end it, honestly.
Yeah.
Are you glad you read this?
Actually, yes. For all the jokes we've made about the political situation we're living through, I feel like reading this book kind of made me a little more sanguine. If just from the standpoint, just the reminder that again, it's like you are an individual in history. You kind of need to like step outside of like the hysteria of historical forces now and again to like be a person, which is something I've been trying to do over the last couple of days. And two, I mean, again, Bolaño wrote this in 1996. If he could see that the Fourth Reich is here and so we've all been living in it, we've all been living under the black sun for however long it's been. And not that much has actually changed.
Yeah.
I don't have any words of wisdom to share with the any of our listeners who are feeling anxious right now. I guess read good books.
And watch out for that one guy in the poetry workshop. The one guy who dresses a little too well. Something might be up with him.
Well, come on, Ben. Our listeners are too smart to be in MFA programs.
Well, I guess we're forming our own MFA program. only the cool people, none of the weirdos. Yeah, so.
There will be no serial killers in the Infinite Library Creative Writing Fellowship coming soon to a university near you. Well, Ben, do you have anything else you want to say?
I mean, I think that's a good place to leave it. I think, forces of history may seem overwhelming, but you're an individual and you can figure it out. So
the key is to understand both levels.
Yeah.
All right. Well, listeners, thank you so much as always. Semper Books.
Semper Books. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you liked our show, We hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.